This is the Dean Abbott podcast. My guest tonight, I'm talking with Professor Nancy Pearcey. Professor Pearcey is the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and Total Truth. She is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She's been quoted in the New Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today, and hailed as in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant intellectual. Thank you for doing this.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's good to actually meet you after.
Oh, yes, we've interacted quite a bit on Twitter.
Right. So it's good. I really appreciate meeting you.
Thank you. Good. It's nice to meet you too. So you wrote a book recently that has been the subject of much discussion. Tell me, when did the book come out? It came out back in the summer, I think, summer of 23.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, end of June.
Mm-hmm. And tell me, if you had to say in one sentence what the thesis of the book is, what is it?
Whoa, long sentence. Well,
it can be as long.
I was aware that it's become socially acceptable to express incredible hostility against men. And so I started out just wanting to get to the bottom of that. Where's this coming from? You can't really stand against a social trend unless you know where it came from and how it developed. So that was my first goal. But while I was researching, I stumbled across data on Christian men, sociological studies done on Christian men. And I realized, well, that gives me answer. Problem, men are attacked for being toxic. Answer, Christian men who are testing out as the most loving and engaged fathers. So it ended up being a really nice, the 2-part theme, problem and solution. Mm-hmm. Does that qualify as one sentence?
Yes, that's good. And so essentially your book is to say that the notion of toxic masculinity has been brought about by secularization. Is that more or less a reasonable summary of your basic idea?
Yeah, it is. I go into some of the history of where secularization came from, how the script for masculinity changed as it became secularized, because America started broadly Christian with the Puritans and all. The colonial era was pretty Christianized, and the view of masculinity was quite different then. Really focused on men's caretaking role in the family, and how it was secularized, and we ended up with traits associated with masculinity, which now a lot of people consider more toxic or more dangerous. And one of the goals I hope to communicate is, if you're concerned about toxic traits of masculinity, it's the secular traits that are what people are really complaining about. And so if you want to get to the solution, let's look at what Christianity teaches about a biblical view of masculinity.
How has the book been received?
Well, to my great surprise, it's been the most controversial book I've ever written. Mm-hmm. And I just did not expect that.
Is it also your most popular book?
I'm not quite sure, because my last one, Love Thy Body, first of all, I thought would be more controversial because it deals with issues like abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism. And some people say it's more relevant now than when I wrote it. But Total Truth is still my best-selling book, actually, in terms of just sheer numbers.
I ask about its popularity because it's sitting on the new nonfiction shelf at my local library down the street.
Oh, good.
And so I'm sorry to derail you, but you were talking about how the book has been received.
Yeah. So, well, it started before the book even came out. So when I write a book, I always teach classes on it. I run reading groups on it. I like to get lots of feedback, so I don't inadvertently have rough edges. Mm-hmm. And when these groups would talk to their friends and family members, we're going through a manuscript on masculinity. Invariably, the first question was, whose side is she on? Mm. And men tended to just assume if a woman's writing a book on masculinity, she's a male bashing feminist.
Mhm.
And more progressive types tended to assume I was a reactionary culture warrior. And so I found that I had to change my first chapter multiple times to try to, in a sense, get people over that initial barrier. Because once they got into the content, they usually thought, "Oh, this is good. This is material I didn't know before." But there was that initial barrier I had to get over. And then when the book came out, the day after it appeared, the book was jumped on and attacked really quite vigorously on Twitter by Christian egalitarians who had not read it, by the way. Um,
Well, yeah. What do
um,
you expect?
they had heard me on some podcasts and had jumped to
Mhm.
conclusions. And so they attacked me on Twitter quite vigorously. And I go ahead and use her name because she is a public figure. But Sheila Gregoire was the person leading the charge, and she has a
Mhm.
40,000 membership group. And so
Wow.
she can basically tell people, you know, sick them, go
Mhm.
go attack this book, and they do. And so it wasn't just her, but several people from her group were all attacking me on Twitter at the same
What
time.
what was that like for you?
Well, it's kind of fun, to be honest. Um, After I got over the shock, I mean, I just didn't expect that because the book, Dean, the book has 2 chapters on abuse, domestic violence and abuse.
Mhm.
And so I thought somewhat more progressive readers would like that part at least because
Mhm.
I'm not one sided. I'm not polemical.
Right.
you know, I look at some of the good parts of masculinity and say we should affirm that. And I look at the negative parts of masculinity, even in the Christian world. I thought people would find it balanced. So after I got over my initial shock, though, then I started to enjoy it. It's kind of fun to have that kind of give and take. But I have to tell you, only a few people came to my defense, and you were one of them. So you
Well,
have my undying gratitude.
yeah, yeah, I was happy to do it. The it seems to me that the Christian egalitarian movement is, well, particularly Sheila's the band that Sheila leads is not a group that's particularly open to to reasoned and balanced discussion. And I've interacted with them several times, and they have in common. They have a not we can't even call it debate style. We have to call it a style of interaction that is exactly what you get when you interact with the neo-patriarchalists, okay? Which is uh, to sort of reduce you to reduce the entire conversation to mockery, accusations, name calling, etc. And in this way, both of those groups are exactly alike. And when someone like you comes along and wants to present a reasoned argument, I think both of those groups have difficulty responding.
Well, actually, that's the next step. After that sort of died down,
Mm.
the egalitarian attacks. And by the way, what I did, of course, is to a large extent, you just have to use that to educate people.
Hmm.
You have to realize you're not going to change their minds, but if you can answer their questions in a reasonable way, then you're educating the other people who are tuning in and listening. One person finally said something like, "Nancy Pearcey not only has good answers, but she's got the receipts." And I thought that was a reference to the fact that yeah, every objection they raised, I could give a quote from the book. I could give quotes from experts, quotes from sociologists, empirical findings. I gave reasoned, like you said, and fact-based responses. And
What?
once, oh, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Go ahead. I didn't mean
Well,
to.
once that died down, then the neo-patriarchalists started up,
What were
and
the
so
egalitarians' basic? I mean, to whatever degree they had a basic objection, what was it? What set them off about the books that they had not, that they could not have read since it came out the day before?
um, so in the book, I give findings from the social sciences showing
Mhm.
that Christian men evangelical, theologically conservative Christian men actually test out as the most loving husbands and most engaged fathers.
Mm-hmm.
And this is research. My biggest study was Brad Wilcox at the
Right.
University of Virginia, one of the best known sociologists of religion in the nation. But I quote about a dozen studies that have been done over the years. And basically, in a nutshell, their argument was you're supporting complementarianism, and that's evil and bad and dangerous.
Right.
That's
Right.
about it.
Right.
And the irony is, I wasn't. I explicitly say in the book, I'm not engaging in the complementarian egalitarian debate. And the reason I don't is because the sociologist and the psychologist that I read said it doesn't seem to make much difference. I give this data in the book. I say, I'm not going to deal with this, and this is why. So, Brad Wilcox, who I already mentioned, as a sociologist, said that he doesn't see much difference between couples that are egalitarian and complementarian. He says what makes a difference is if they're family centered. If a man treats his family as the most important thing in his life, no matter what his gender theory is, he'll be a good husband. And the other quote was from a non-Christian. Brad Wilcox is Catholic. The other one is John Gottman, who's Jewish. Yeah. And one again,
and certainly no fly-by-night brush off researcher, right?
Absolutely. I mean, if
world famous,
probably considered the top marriage psychologist in the country. Mm-hmm. And he too said, I have people coming into my practice. Some of them think the man should be in charge of the relationship, and some of them are more egalitarian. And he said, I'm not seeing a difference. And here's how he put it. Emotionally intelligent husbands have figured out the one most important thing, which is how to convey honor and respect to your wife. And so I put these two quotes in. I said, I'm not even dealing with this topic. And then everyone who jumped on me tried to push me into the complementarian, egalitarian debate.
I think we live in a time, and maybe Twitter itself contributes to this, where and certainly I would say this is something I've seen repeatedly from Sheila and her approach to things is we must first and foremost begin with our ideology. And data that contradicts it must be untrue. And that we begin with the assumption that we know what the answers must be because we have an inflexible narrative. And so the narrative is all complementarian husbands are abusers. And complementarianism itself gives rise, like you mentioned in the book, gives rise to abuse. And so that's the narrative, the popular narrative. And then when there's data that actually contradicts that, that can't be allowed to stand. Right. And so you irritated them by calling their narrative into question.
Yeah, and the irony is, of course, I didn't expect to find this. I was blown away by these findings. If you've read the book, so you know that I grew up in a very abusive home. My father was a very conservative, theologically conservative Lutheran who insisted that we go to church every Sunday, and then he would come home and beat us. And so I didn't expect to find this myself. It's not like I came with a preconceived position to defend. I was quite blown away by the studies that I read and the especially the quotes. Some of the studies were extensively quoting from evangelical couples, from husbands and wives, and I would read them and say, I had no idea. I had no idea that evangelical couples would express a view of headship that was so loving and so respectful and so mutual. So it was just as much a surprise to me as to anyone else. But I'm going to go with the data,
right?
Because that's and that's what we should go with.
I think your ultimate point is that it matters less what a man's abstract understanding of the family is than whether or not he's a jerk. And that if you have a left-leaning, liberal, feminist father, liberal feminist father, who is a loving man, that's better than having a father who is a conservative complementarian and a big abusive jerk.
Yes, well, one of the most surprising things from the findings was that there's a big difference between evangelical men who attend church regularly and who are
Mm-hmm.
really committed versus nominal Christian
Right.
men.
Right.
Because evangelical men who attend church regularly, the wives report the highest levels of happiness. They spend the most time with their kids, 3.5 hours more than secular men. They have the lowest rate of divorce and the lowest rate of domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, the first pushback I always got on that was, but haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as everyone else? And so researchers went back to the data and they made that crucial distinction, men who attend church regularly versus nominal men. And they test out shockingly different. They fit all the toxic stereotypes,
Mm-hmm.
right? Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They spend the least amount of time with their kids. They have the highest rate of divorce, higher than secular men, 20% higher than secular men, and they have the highest rate of domestic violence, even higher than secular men. So this is where a lot of the negative stereotypes come from, because on the one hand, committed Christian men are better than secular men, but nominals are worse than secular men. And a lot of our negative stereotypes are then based on the fact that too many of us know these nominals. And by the way, that is why I had to include 2 chapters on abuse. If nominal Christian men are the most abusive of any group in America, I couldn't just sweep that under the carpet. I had to have a couple of chapters on that topic.
I'd like to come back to that in a moment. But I think, to be fair, first, we should acknowledge that after leading a charge against you and receiving quite a bit of pushback, Sheila did apologize on Twitter and take some time off from Twitter as a result of the interaction that happened between her and her followers and you.
First of all, there were about 3 people who did pushback. It was not as much as I thought would be.
Right.
Most people did not want to get in the middle of that. So you were one of the
right.
few.
Right.
But you are right. What changed was when somebody published an article defending me. So that was not on Twitter.
Yeah, that was
an
Jake
article.
Meador or something.
Right, Jake Meador in Mere Orthodoxy.
Right.
And he focused on one particular point of history that Sheila was jumping on me for. And he defended me on that point of history. And he said, she's just being an accurate historian. You know, what she's reporting what this meant at the time. And after so I forget who it was. Somebody said to me, notice it was after a man defended you. And I'm not sure if that was relevant. But anyway, after there was a published defense, was it the next 2 days later? 2 days later, Sheila did apologize. So you're right. It's important to say that.
And so after that died down, you got some attention from the other side?
It was after Peter Leithart published a review in First Things. And he said, Nancy is right when she tells us what the meaning of Azer is in Genesis. Azer is help. When Genesis says a woman was created to be a help. And of course, that word for us today means, nice little assistant. And that's not what it means in the original Hebrew. In the original Hebrew, it's usually used of God, actually. In the Old Testament, it's used most often of God when God comes to somebody's rescue. Comes an ever-present help in trouble. And when it's not God, it's a military ally coming to help. So he said, Peter Leithart said, it doesn't mean a little assistant. It means more like a military ally. Military ally was enough to really trigger a lot of neo-patriarchalists who thought that sounded like it wasn't feminine enough. I had people saying, you're denigrating women's domestic role. And my response
why were you doing that?
What?
I said, why would you do that?
And actually, my response was, well, where do you think the spiritual battles are fought? The most intense spiritual battles are in the home. And the woman had better be a spiritual warrior. She's fighting for her children. And hopefully the home is also a realm of of evangelism and hospitality where you're bringing other people in and you're fighting for truth in their lives as well. A woman had better be a fighter. So that was my and of course ultimately the question is who cares what you want it to mean? The question is what does it mean in the Hebrew? Let's be
Right.
accurate. Let's start with just being accurate in terms of our translation.
You may have seen that I have on Twitter from time to time been critical of the neo patriarchal thing.
Hmm.
What is your general assessment of that movement?
Yeah, so I've tried to read them sympathetically,
Hmm.
like we should for anybody. Um, and certainly the manosphere in general seems to be a response to the fact that boys and men are falling behind. Right? They're
Hmm.
falling behind at all levels of education, starting in kindergarten. Right?
Right.
They don't have the same fine motor control, so they can't operate as scissors as well. So from kindergarten on, they're feeling like they're falling behind.
Right.
Their their grades, their test scores. The average university now is 60% female students, 40% male.
Hmm.
Graduate school, more women than men in graduate school and professional school. And then as adults, men are falling behind in the sense of having much higher rates than women of mental illness, homelessness, drug and alcohol addiction,
Hmm.
um, homelessness. Did I say that? Um,
You did.
and and even unemployment. Unemployment, according to scholars, uh, it doesn't show in the it doesn't show up in the unemployment statistics because they stopped looking for work. And so researchers had to dig deeper, and they now tell us that male unemployment is at Great Depression era levels. That was a shock
Hmm.
because we all remember what a tragedy the Great Depression was. And then life expectancy, male life expectancy has also gone down. Women's has stayed the same, so it's not a general trend. A magazine called The New Scientist
Uh-huh.
did a article on it and said the major demographic factor for early death is being male. So I think if you look at all of this, we can understand why men feel like they're under siege. Um, a couple of years ago, a survey found that 45% of American men feel like society punishes men just for being men.
Mm-hmm.
Or another quote that I have was from a psychotherapist who writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal. And she said, the young men coming into my practice are especially feeling demoralized and
Mm.
beaten down because they feel like they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity. So I think a lot of what we're seeing in the manosphere, whether it's the Christian version or the secular version, is people responding to that, to the fact that men are losing their sense of direction, losing their sense
Mhm.
of purpose. I just read today, there's a group that put out a study called The State of the American Man, I
Mhm.
think was the title. And it's a very liberal group.
Mhm.
It was called something like the Center on Masculinities, plural, and Social Justice. But they did pull together a lot of good facts. And one of the things they found, for example, is 48% of men said that their online life was more engaging and more rewarding than their real life.
For sure.
48%. That's almost
Oh, for sure.
half.
Mhm.
And then they found out boys, they looked at younger boys in particular because they are the ones most likely to say they don't have a sense of purpose in life. And you'll find this kind of interesting. Even though this group is progressive, they said progressive young men are particularly likely to say they're lonely and have no direction or purpose in life.
Yeah, I would assume that that the causal relationship goes loneliness, therefore progressive, rather than progressive, therefore lonely. And that men who are lonely, men who have a difficulty with relationships, men who have difficulty with women in particular, are more likely to believe that society needs to be radically restructured in order to help them, and that progressive politics appeals to the desire to radically restructure politics so that your personal life is more successful.
But what they found,
Mm.
this is kind of interesting. They said the men who accepted a more traditional view of masculinity tended to feel more confident
Hmm.
and feel more like they had a sense of direction. and it's the progressives who did not. Of course, because this organization was progressive, they didn't like the fact that traditional masculine, uh, the man box, right, is what they
Right.
called it.
Mm.
The man box actually was the men who lived by that definition of masculinity were actually more confident and felt more optimistic about their life and so on. And that was not what they wanted to find.
Mhm.
Um, but because of that, when you ask me what do I think about it, so I've tried to really listen to the manosphere, and I think we have to take their concerns seriously
Mhm.
because a lot of them are concerned. I told my class, I teach at Houston Christian University,
Mhm.
and when I told them I was writing a book on masculinity, one of the male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us."
Mm. Mhm.
And I thought, really? Even in a Christian environment, there are
Mhm.
men who feel this way.
Right.
So I feel like we need to pay attention to that. We're not going to have a good solution unless we really pay attention to the problem.
Do you have reservations about the way that you see online, particularly Christian online masculinity movements going?
Well, so many of them think they're being traditional.
Mm.
um, by going back to, man is the head, woman is submissive, and she shouldn't walk outside the home,
Mhm.
and she should be perfectly fulfilled being a mother and a homemaker and so on. Well, my response to that is that's not traditional enough. That's going back to the 1950s. If you want to be traditional, go back to the pre-industrial age when both husband and wife were able to share in economically productive work and raising the children. There
Right.
wasn't this division of labor. It was on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. Husband and wife worked side by side, and fathers were literally just as involved in rearing their children as mothers were in terms of
Right.
the sheer time that they spent. In fact, interesting historical fact: most books on child rearing back then were addressed to fathers,
Mm.
not
Mhm.
to mothers like they are now, because
Is
the father was considered the primary parent.
the point about the Industrial Revolution is one that Wendell Berry has been making for 50 years. Wendell Berry, someone who, especially early in his career, tangled with feminists in a particular kind of way quite a bit too, um, precisely for making the point that you are making. Um, I was distracted for a moment. I'm sorry. I was looking for a tweet that I wrote a few days ago and I can't find it. I was going to read it to you and ask you your reaction, but I'll just talk about it for a moment and give you and see what you think. A lot of the neo-patriarchal Christian masculine revival people, um, while I may in fact have a lot of sympathy with some of them, some of their substantive points, the tweet that I wrote about them was that at their heart, so I'm thinking particularly of sort of Christian pastors online. The major one is a guy named Eric Kahn. I don't know if
Mhm,
you're familiar with him,
mhm,
who has gotten lots of attention for writing a tweet in which he said, fathers send young women off to college to become used up mattresses.
oh.
I don't know if that's true at Houston Christian or not, but and then he got a lot of attention for complaining about yoga pants, and he very liberally uses the word hoe to describe women.
Mm.
And he posts pictures of himself on Twitter carrying an axe and riding a horse with a gun and all of this sort of performative masculine stuff. And it seems to me that those guys and they're exactly like Sheila Gregoire's band of followers, in that they respond to all criticism with mockery. Um, and what I said to them, what I said about them was that at their heart, I think that they are ambivalent about Christian
Mm.
virtues. And so things like kindness, patience, lovingness, gentleness, these things all sit very uneasily with their idea of masculinity. And they might deny that, but it certainly they sit uneasily with their online behavior, right? So to say these hoes are a bunch of used up mattresses, this is not um, this is not communicating in a way that evidences gentleness, peacefulness, self-control, kindness, etc. And so what I said was that a lot of these guys, I think, are confused, and they're confused and they're bothered by Christian values, and they really desire a culture based around martial values, right? And they are bothered that Jesus is not more like Mars, the pagan, the classical god of war. And that is what they want. They want Jesus to be like Mars, who exemplifies all of the warlike values. And in this way, I said, they're essentially pagan at heart, in that they are bothered, they're embarrassed by that part of Jesus that called into question those martial values in the most militaristic culture in the history of the world. And that, I think, they're bothered by Jesus in that way. And because if they weren't, they would not. So I heard Eric Kahn on a podcast say that he sees Twitter as a gladiatorial arena,
Oh.
and that his goal is to give the people blood. Now, that entire metaphor
Whoa.
is a metaphor that flows from a worldview that is martial, and that lives out the almost kind of the worship of Mars in a way. And not it was in fact Christians who stopped the gladiatorial games.
That's a good point.
And so to sort of bring that mindset and that view to online culture warring, it seems to me that to whatever degree these guys are supporting men in a culture that diminishes and devalues them, they aren't really doing it from a fully Christian perspective, because they are confused between Jesus and Mars. So that's my point, and maybe you don't want to say anything about that, but that's what I think.
Well, what's fascinating is there's a secular historian who says something very similar to what you just said.
Mm.
Excuse me. His name is Peter Stearns, teaches at George Mason University, and he wrote a book called "Be a Man," and it's a history of concepts of manhood. And here's what he says: your concept of manhood derives from your view of God. And so he says, polytheistic cultures, the gods are constantly fighting. As he puts it, they wenched, they drank, they fought, they celebrated military valor. And so in those cultures, to be a man was to be a warrior, the warrior ethic. And there's some truth to that. It's not, but it's very imbalanced. And then he goes on and he says, monotheism. Well, some forms of monotheism, God is so transcendent that he has no relationship with humans.
Right.
I quote actually a book on Islam that says Allah would not condescend to have a personal relationship with a mere mortal. That would be repugnant to Allah. So that kind of monotheism is represented, especially by Islam. And therefore, to be a man is to exercise power, authority. And then again, this secular historian says, then you get Judaism. Judaism is monotheistic, but God does have a relationship with his people. Right? I will give them a heart to know me, Jeremiah says. So to be a man is to be a loving father. And then this secular historian says Jesus comes along and complexifies everything. Because Jesus says, he pulls together all the best of what's been said about masculinity, but he introduces something that's totally new: servant leadership. He says no other religion has had that. The Son of Man has come not to be served, but to serve. there was no other religion whose God comes to serve his
Mhm.
people.
Mhm.
And he concludes that therefore Christianity has the best of all of these different religions, but it includes that the man is not only a warrior and not only has power, but here's how he puts it: Jesus exemplifies what were said to be, typically said to be more feminine virtues like gentleness, tenderness,
Mhm.
compassion, and so on. And so he says in Christianity, men can be both tough and tender, right?
Mhm.
Both courageous and compassionate. And so it's so fun to hear that from a secular perspective. Someone who's
Mhm.
not even a Christian, he sees it better than most of us do. And like we all learn better by compare and contrast. So
Mhm.
by comparing it to these other religions, we can see more clearly what is unique about Christianity. He says what most people have considered, more suitable for more appropriate for women have become masculine virtues in Christianity.
Mm, mhm, mm, mhm, mm. Yes, I think that these guys are they've latched onto a real problem,
Hmm.
but they don't seem to understand how their approach needs to account for the fullness of Jesus being, right? They
Hmm.
love to talk about Jesus flipping over the tables in the temple because when they call women hoes, they think that's what they're doing. Um, but they are unable to incorporate the fullness of Jesus, which is to say, they don't understand God in the Christian narrative as both a helpless infant and and a a a beaten murder victim. That God is both of these things in Jesus, as well as the guy who turns over the tables. And
Yeah.
they're unwilling to incorporate the places where Jesus in his life exemplifies a sort of defenseless vulnerability to the evil of the world.
Or where he stands against the culture.
Mhm.
Some of the things that Jesus did don't really strike us because we don't know anymore how revolutionary it was in his context. For example, the one that really hit me was Jesus blessing the children. Okay, that's a Sunday school image. It's usually very
Mhm.
sentimental in pastel colors. But actually, that was a revolutionary act because in the Roman culture at that time, children were considered non persons. There was very little respect for children. The language describing them was always very negative. They're weak, they're helpless. We don't have respect for anybody who's weak. Um, and of course, as you know, fathers could kill their child for any reason or no reason. It was legally fine for a father to kill his child. Abortion and infanticide were widespread. So again, that expresses a very low view of life and of children, and especially girls. By the way, it
Mhm.
was very rare for a Roman family to have more than one daughter. They'd have a token daughter, but after that,
Mhm.
you know, girls were particularly likely to be either aborted or left out to die. Exposure. Anyway, so well, first of all, when Jesus is approached by these parents with their children, you can understand why the disciples tried to shoo them away. Like, who cares about kids? So when Jesus stands against that and says, "No, we have value. Suffer the little children to come unto me," that was actually quite revolutionary at that time. It wasn't just a soft focused Sunday school moment. He was standing against the culture, and by the way, and when he said things like, if you don't enter the kingdom of God as a child, you won't enter. You can read the church fathers puzzling over what that possibly could mean
Mhm.
because no one had ever set up children as a model for adults
Mm.
before.
Mhm. Mhm.
So when we look at it in the cultural context, Jesus was far more revolutionary than we realize.
Mhm.
And other things are more obvious. They've been written about more.
Right.
Jesus' treatment of women. That he spoke to them in public in a culture where you didn't speak to women in public. The woman at the well in particular. Notice the woman at the well, she was a Samaritan,
Right.
but the text says, it doesn't say he was surprised. They were surprised that he was talking to a Samaritan. It says they were
Mhm.
surprised he was talking to a woman. That was
Right.
far worse than
Right.
talking to a
Right. Right.
Samaritan. Or Mary at Jesus' feet. The idiom of sitting at someone's feet meant you were a disciple. And
Mm.
so sitting at the feet of the rabbi meant that Jesus was treating her as a disciple. So there's a number of things. And by the way, then he scolds Martha for doing the traditionally feminine
Oh,
job
that's true. Right.
of
That's
preparing
right.
dinner. So there's a lot of parts in scripture that we kind of, we no longer realize how revolutionary they were. That Jesus was actually standing against his culture in a whole host of ways, in favor of giving dignity to women and children.
He's complexifying everything far beyond what we have in the in either the sort of egalitarian or the neo-patriarchal camps. He's presenting a much more complicated and human picture.
Yeah, and the other thing that I find is important for well, for both men and women, but since I wrote a book on men, um, is the cultural mandate.
Mhm.
A lot of times when we call men to a deeper spiritual life, we focus on the religious activities, going to church and praying and Bible reading and so on. But Scripture gives us a much richer, fuller understanding what it means to live for God, and it's in Genesis, so it's pre-fall. Right? It says right after God creates the human race, male and female, the first thing he says to them is he gives them the job description, right? Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. And in the streamlined language of Genesis 1, we can unpack those words. Like be fruitful and multiply doesn't just mean have a family,
Right.
because anthropologists tell us all the social institutions go out of the family. It becomes an
Mhm.
extended family, tribe, you know, um, a nation, an ethnic group, and then there's specific social institutions for specific purposes, like we need a state, we need some kind of government, we need a church, we need a school, we need a marketplace. And
Right.
so it really means that men are called to roll up their sleeves and build all of these social institutions. And subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So of course it starts usually with agriculture, but mining, technology, until we get up to our own day, inventing computers,
Right.
composing music. One of my
Mm.
students once said, "Oh, come on, composing music." So I play the violin, and I said to him, "What's the violin made out of? Wood. And what's the bow made out of? Horsehair." So all the transcendent beauty we associate with music starts with harnessing the natural resources of creation. And so this is a much fuller understanding of what it means to be a man.
Mhm. Mhm.
It means that you are all of your work in terms of building up your civilization, your community, and then all the work you do in terms of producing products that are beneficial and that serve people and glorify God.
And
You know,
that's
it's
why he needs help.
and that's why what
That's why he
you,
needs help.
to,
That's the work he needs help to do.
oh, I see. That's why in Genesis God creates a woman to be his help. Gotcha. Okay.
Right. So it's not,
Right, right.
yeah, I think that's an important point. She's not his personal servant. She's there to help him to fulfill this. He can't do what he needs to do to be fully human without her, is the point.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, good point.
We've elapsed our time here. Tell people a little bit about where you're going from here, where they can find out more about you, where they can get your books. I know they're available on Amazon, but where else?
Yeah, well, so my publisher very graciously redesigned my website, so it's colorful and fun now. So come on over to nancypearcey.com, and there you can browse my books and read the endorsements, and you can leave a message. You can come over and say hello. So that would be the best general place to go is nancypearcey.com, because you can order all my books that way. And if you're not familiar with them, you can take a look and see what else I've written. And I'm pretty, as you have noted, I'm pretty active on Twitter, so you can come and say hello there as well.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been fun talking with you.